Hi there. Thank you so much. I've been asked to speak about pesticides and pollen. What are the bees in America consuming? And most of this research is based on work I did as a postdoc at the University of Maryland as part of the National Honeybee Disease Survey. So pesticides and pollen. I'm just going to give a brief outline of my talk. First, I'll do an introduction to US beekeeping. Then I will delve into the stress factors that bees and beekeepers are facing. Then we will go into how do we calculate exposure risk, followed by actual results from the National Honeybee Disease Survey, and finally a summary of the findings. So a brief into US beekeeping. When we think of beekeeping, we tend to think of our own personal experiences with beekeeping. And most beekeepers within Europe, even commercial beekeepers, tend to be significantly smaller, managing anywhere from 150 to 500 colonies. Whereas in the United States, for commercial beekeeping, you're really only considered a commercial beekeeper if you manage 2,000 hives or more. Next, please. In the United States, we have on average about 2.8 million colonies. This has increased in the last 5 years. It used to be around 2.6 million. The average honey yield per colony is about 55 pounds, and there are about 25,000 people involved in the beekeeping industry, in commercial beekeeping as employees. Next, please. So here you see a slide from the Bee Informed Partnership about colony losses. And it used to be that we just surveyed for winter losses. This started after colony collapse disorder in 2006, 2007, when beekeepers experienced elevated losses of about 35%, some beekeepers losing all the way up to 90% of their colonies. This survey was then expanded to include summer losses, which you can see here in yellow. The blue losses are winter losses, and then the red bars represent annual losses throughout the entire year. And you can see that annual losses most beekeepers are experiencing range between 35 and 45% of the year. So about almost half of their colonies they're losing at some point in the year during their year. And commercial beekeepers tend to have this pretty evenly split, with half of those losses occurring in the summer and half of those losses occurring over the winter. Next slide, please. And so we sort of have to wonder, are beekeepers reaching a tipping point? When you have to make up a loss every year of a 40% colony loss, that means you have to do a lot more splitting, you have to make a lot more supplemental colonies, you have to winter a lot more so that you know you're bringing them out of the winter, because commercial beekeepers in the United States are very dependent on pollination. The biggest pollination contract is almond pollination, which occurs in February every year, and you need at least 5 frames of bees to be paid for a pollination contract, and you want somewhere between 5 and 8 frames of bees. Next slide, please. And so honeybees, while they are not at danger of going extinct, the number of managed colonies around the world has actually been increasing. The question of whether our commercial beekeepers will continue to be able to survive does become questionable. They have more and more rising costs of keeping their colonies alive. It's not unusual for commercial beekeepers in the United States to do between 4 and 8 varroa treatments in a year, because their colonies are constantly in brood, and so they're constantly producing varroa mites. As I said, we tend to have elevated summer losses, where commercial beekeepers are losing about 20% of their colonies over the summer, when typically colonies are expanding and thriving. And this has a lot to do with the stressful nature of moving from pollination contract to pollination contract. There is a loss of safe habitat for recovery between pollination events. So in the past, they could move them out into the prairies where you had a lot of wildflower forage and you could do honey production and give your colonies a break and a chance to recover. The problem is a lot of that forage has now disappeared as our agricultural lands are turned into soy and corn production for the ethanol industry. Next slide, please. And so this is from the National Honey Board. Here you just see some of the migratory routes of beekeepers. Most beekeepers in the summer months migrate to those upper northern states in North Dakota and South Dakota for honey production, whereas they all migrate. We need 2.6 million colonies every February in California for almond pollination. And so a lot of beekeepers will move their hives south into Texas or Florida or California for the winter, give them a chance to build up, migrate to California for almond pollination in February, and then conduct a series of different pollination contracts throughout the spring and summer. Next slide, please. And so migratory beekeeping, I just wanted to include some photos to try and represent the scale of what we're talking about. We're talking about tractor trailer loads with up to 450 single colonies on it. And most of the time, beekeepers are working late at night, loading colonies, trucking bees, keeping them moving so that they can get them to their pollination destination. Next slide, please. And so the reason they're all doing this is for almond pollination. They receive up to $200 per colony for an almond contract. And so if you show up with 5,000 colonies, that's $1 million that you're earning at that time point. And that pretty much covers your costs for keeping that colony alive throughout the rest of the season. And then any additional pollination contracts that beekeeper does, that is his actual profit for the year. Next slide, please. And so here you see some of the prices paid for pollination. They're cash crops for beekeepers, everything from almonds to alfalfa seeds, apples and avocado, blueberry, even carrot and onion. That's a pretty tough crop on the bees. Cherry, cranberry, cucumber, plum, pumpkin, and raspberry. And so it's not unusual for an individual colony to do about 4 different pollination events in a single season. Next slide, please. And so beekeepers, for the large part, when we talk about large commercial beekeepers, their focus is really on pollination, on those pollination contracts. They're set up to move those boxes quickly and efficiently. They tend not to think of colonies individually, but as an apiary yard or as pollination units they have available. Next slide, please. Whereas we also have a huge amount of backyard beekeepers. Our backyard beekeepers often have much higher winter losses. They typically experience 30 to 45% winter losses, but have very low spring and summer losses. Our backyard beekeepers typically manage 3 to 8 colonies, and this is the majority when you look at the number of beekeepers. It's estimated to be about 285,000 in the United States. However, it's hard to know exactly how many hobby beekeepers we have. Our USDA survey only counts beekeepers that manage at least 5 colonies and produce honey. And the majority of backyard beekeepers are stationary. And then we also have sideliners. Sideliners tend to run about 150 to 500 colonies. It's not their main source of income, but it does provide substantial income for the family. Next slide, please. And so what are some of the stress factors that bees and beekeepers are facing? One of the problems that we're having is that more and more land is lost. And so habitat that used to be very flower rich has been converted into developments, housing, and is no longer providing nectar and pollen. Next slide, please. And so it really is death by 1,000 little cuts. Some of the factors impacting colony health are of course, varroa mites, which you see in the top left. Varroa mites are not the main problem. Varroa mites by themselves, a colony can survive with. The problem is that varroa mites are transmitters of viruses, especially things like deformed wing virus and acute bee paralysis virus. And these viruses are actually what cause the colony to succumb. The viruses have now adapted, especially deformed wing virus, and it can reproduce within the mite. And that virus that is then injected into a honeybee can then end up in the honeybee brain and end up resulting in crippled wings. We also have consistently more and more treatments on our agricultural fields. Our agricultural fields have grown much larger. And as soon as you have a monoculture, a large monoculture, more parasites and diseases tend to attack it. And so the solution is often pesticide application, such as fungicides to control mold. And the other issue we're having is more and more habitat fragmentation. And so a lot of the wild places we used to have been broken up. Our farms have also gotten larger and we farm from edge to edge. And so whereas in the past, we had smaller family farms, and along the farm edges, you would have hedgerows, you would have a lot of weeds. We've moved in our agricultural industry more and more to Roundup Ready crops where the entire field is sprayed. And so although the Roundup Ready treatment is not negatively impacting the bees directly, it is eliminating a lot of the forage sources they used to have that used to grow in amongst the crop, and those are eliminated. Next slide, please. And so there are multiple interacting stress factors, and these are really hard to disentangle. Everything from poor nutrition, as well as changing climate. Climate change is actually impacting the protein content of our pollen. So they've looked at goldenrod, which is a major late summer, early fall protein source for honeybees. And the goldenrod from 100 years ago compared to the goldenrod growing today has a much lower protein content. And so even when bees are able to find forage of nectar and pollen, sometimes that food that they're finding is not as nutritious as it used to be. Beekeepers are also experiencing increased levels of queen failure. It is not unusual that a queen does not make it through her first season, does not survive for a full year. Whereas in the past, it was not uncommon that once you had a queen, she would live for 2 to 3 and sometimes 4 years, continuing to lay eggs corner to corner on a frame. As I've already mentioned, we're having more and more habitat destruction. About 124,000 acres are plowed under every day. We also have an increased use in pesticides. A lot of these pesticides are a new type of pesticide that are less detrimental immediately to bee health and so are considered bee safe, but they are pervading our entire environment. And so bees are encountering many more different types of pesticides. There's also, through globalization, an increase in the number of parasites, and those parasites tend to transmit other diseases as well. And so you have a slew of brood diseases and viruses, all of which are impacting the health of bees. Next slide, please. And so this is from an op-ed in 2014 by Mark Winston in the New York Times, in which he writes, "Honeybee collapse has been particularly vexing because there is no one cause, but rather 1,000 little cuts. The main elements include the compounding impact of pesticides applied to fields, as well as pesticides applied directly into hives to control mites. Fungal, bacterial, and viral pests and diseases, nutritional deficiencies caused by vast acreages of single crop fields that lack a diverse flowering plants, and in the United States, commercial beekeeping itself, which disrupts colonies by moving most bees around the country multiple times each year to pollinate crops. The real issue, though, is not the volume of problems, but the interactions among them. Here we find a core lesson from the bees that we ignore at our peril. The concept of synergy, where 1 + 1 = 3 or 4 or more." Next slide, please. And so what our honeybees really need is they need an access to a diverse array of pollen. Pollen is their protein source. Honeybees, the nurse bees in particular, consume this pollen and convert it into proteinaceous brood food, what they feed to the next generation of bees. And there's more and more research showing that so long as bees have access to a varied diet of pollen, they're much more stress resistant. When they are exposed to monoculture crops and a more limited diet, they become more susceptible to disease, especially gut pathogens such as nosema. Next slide, please. And whereas honeybees live in a social colony and have a large foraging force and also a buffer force, so they can sustain a loss of foragers and the colony still survives. Next, please. Solitary bees, as depicted here, up above you see the European orchard bee, down below you see a leafcutter bee, and you see that they collect pollen and build an individual ball which they moisten with nectar. Onto this pollen ball is laid an individual egg. That egg hatches and consumes that pollen directly. And so solitary bees do not have a buffer force of nurse bees that act as filters to try and remove some of the pesticide contaminations. So when we use honeybees as a model, they may actually be a poor model system for understanding the impact on solitary bees, since the honeybees can act as a filter in a honeybee colony, whereas in solitary bees, they're consuming that pollen directly. Next slide, please. And so the question is, how do we calculate exposure risk? Risk is really difficult to assess. And so in a recent paper, we looked at 5 different ways of measuring exposure risk. Next, please. So one of the ways we looked at it is pesticide prevalence. And when you look at pesticide prevalence, the question is, do we find any pesticide residue in a pollen sample? And these pollen samples were an apiary-wide sample. So it was pollen collected from eight individual colonies and put together, and then that pollen was analyzed for any pesticide residues. And so the question is, how saturated is the environment? Do we still have areas that are pesticide free, where the bees are collecting pollen and there's absolutely no pesticide contamination? Next, please. The second way we looked at this exposure risk is we looked at how many different pesticides do you find in a single sample. This is what we call pesticide diversity. And this goes at the question of synergy, because if you have one pesticide, then there's no potential synergism or antagonisms, and you just have the impact of that one pesticide. But as you add more and more pesticides, the potential interactions and combinations increase dramatically. And so one of the ways of looking at risks is also to assess how many different types of pesticides are in that sample. Next, please. And then we also looked at how much pesticide in sheer quantity do we detect, because it's a foreign substance and bees have to detoxify that foreign substance. And so even though a foreign substance may be benign, it may be tying up their detoxification mechanism. And so this is what we call pesticide concentration. Next, please. And then how do we just ignore the noise in the environment? Just as we're allowed to have certain particles in our drinking water below a certain level, we want to eliminate the noise. And so we tried to find a way of looking at how do we sort of tune out the pesticides that are there, but are potentially not at an actual consumption risk. And we did this by using an LD50 score. An LD50 is the dose of a pesticide that will kill half of the bees in a cage study. And so if you consume your LD50 within 10 days of your nursing phase, we would expect half of the bees to die. And so the score of that is a score of 10,000. And so we took only 1/20th of that, so 0.5% of an LD50, which translates into an HQ score of 50, as another way of looking at pesticide risk. Next, please. And the final way we looked at risk is the actual hazard quotient score. So what is the risk of actually consuming that pesticide during your entire nursing phase with the assumption that you're not detoxifying it? So it's a simplified model, but it at least gives us some way of starting to attempt to understand how risky is consuming that pollen to the bees that are interacting with it. Next slide, please. And so I'm going to now share with you results from the National Honeybee Disease Survey. These, again, they looked at bee bread that was stored in that arch right above the brood nest. They tended to collect fresh matte colored pollen, not pollen that had been in the colony for a long time, which has a shiny coating to it because it's been preserved with nectar. So this is really that fresh matte colored pollen. Next slide, please. And so on the pollen sample collection, it's an apiary sample, as I mentioned before. It's pooled from 8 hives within a single apiary. From each hive, at least 4 cells of fresh pollen were collected. We tried to sample 10 apiary sites within a state, and altogether from 2001 to 2017, we looked at over 1,000 apiaries from 41 US states and Puerto Rico. Samples were collected from January through December, depending on, of course, what was still accessible at that time of year, and they were often piggybacked onto apiary inspections. So it's not an ideal surveying tendency where you return every time, the same time of year, and look at the same sites again, but rather these were part of the National Honeybee Disease Survey, where apiaries inspectors are going out and checking on colonies in their states anyway. Next slide, please. And so here's just a diagram to show how many samples were collected each year, 2011 to 2017. And you can see that 2011 sample collection started in July and ran through November. The months are on the left-hand side and they're color-coded by year. The size of the bar indicates how many samples. whereas the samples that we collected in 2017, our first samples came in March and they ended in June. And so there's really no overlap in 2011 and 2017. That's due to funding cycles. So just bear that in mind when looking at results. We have throughout the year samples from 2012 to 2016, but you have to take the results from 2011 and 2017 with a grain of salt. Next slide, please. And so when we look at pesticide prevalence, this is just whether or not the samples had any pesticide residues. And this map is on a scale from 0 to 1, 1 being where every sample we looked at in that state had at least one pesticide residue. And you can see that the majority of the states are pretty dark. They're at the 0.6 to 1.0 range. This is not surprising because we're also looking at varroicides. Beekeepers are treating their colonies with varroicides. And so you typically tend to find at least one pesticide residue in every sample. On average, we had about 18% of all samples that were completely pesticide free. Next slide, please. This shows it broke down by product type. On the top bar chart, the bar is in gray. That is all pesticides, and on the bottom left to right is the year. So from 2011 to 2017 as you progress from left to right. The bar charts shown in yellow, those are insecticides, and I use the same color scheme throughout. So you can see that the trend line for insecticides is that over time we're finding fewer insecticide residues, where in fungicides shown in orange and herbicides shown in red, the trend is that we have more and more detections of those two types of pesticide classes with time. Next slide, please. And so we also looked at pesticide diversity. Pesticide diversity, again, is where we look at how many different pesticide residues are in a given sample. And here the scale is from 0 to 10. We start being concerned when we have 5 or more pesticides in a given sample, because then the potential for synergistic interaction is just exponentially higher. And you can see that there are 2 states that are really outliers here. This is California and the state of Nebraska. California is our agricultural heartland. They tend to have a lot of specialty crops and they tend to use a lot of fungicides. And fungicides tend to, because they're lipid, they like fatty products, they tend to hang out in the pollens really well. In Nebraska, that's in the heart of our corn belt, and that's actually a state where we found a lot of neonicotinoid residues. Next slide, please. And here you can see from left to right, from 0 to 21, how many different pesticide residues we found in a single sample. You can see that in 189, that first bar chart on the left, that's how many pesticide bee bread samples were completely pesticide free. And the majority had between 1 and 3 different pesticide residues. Our average across all samples was 2.78. And if you only look at the pesticide positive, so if you eliminate those 189 that are pesticide free, then the average climbs to 3.39 products per sample. However, we do have quite a number of samples still with 5+. You see 70 in that column with 5, and then it very rapidly comes down. So 70, 42, 32. So we tend to have a cluster right around 5, but we do find up to 18 and 21 different pesticide residues in pollen. So this is a very short-term sample. It's not like wax, which tends to bioaccumulate pesticides. Next slide, please. And so you see here, you see the total detections over time. You can see that they increase with time, and the bar charts show the average. And so in 2014 and 2016, we had higher averages. That red line shows you where we have at least 5 pesticides in a given sample. And all of those black dots just represent how many samples are above that. This is really just a way of showing that we have significant samples with a multitude of pesticides in it, but on average, we're below 3. Next slide, please. And so when we look at pesticide diversity, you can see that there's no change, there is a change over time where it's significantly increasing over time in the gray. It's a very slight trend to having more pesticide diversity in a given sample. Whereas in insecticides, you see the same pattern we had with the prevalence. It's going down over time, whereas in fungicides and insecticides, it's increasing. Next slide, please. And so when we look at them by different pesticide class, we divided them up to see what are we really finding. And you see that the majority of what we find, over 40% of all samples, are varroasides, represented here in red. We also have about 20% of insecticides, 20% of fungicides, and about 10% of herbicides. Of the 2,933 total detections that we had, we only found neonicotinoids 60 times. So 2.1% of all pesticide detections were neonicotinoids. The same was for insect growth regulators. We had 62 total detections. Those are two classes of pesticides, which of course have gotten a lot of attention in the last few years. Next slide, please. And so when we look at pesticide concentration, this is just the sheer amount of pesticides in part per billion that is in a given sample. And again, this is a way of looking at risk because any foreign substance a honeybee has to detoxify. And even if it's a benign substance, it still has to remove it from its system, and it may tie up its detoxification machinery. Again, you tend to see certain states here highlighted, such as California, Florida, and then our upper northeast around the Great Lakes, where again, we have a lot of specialty crops, and then the Corn Belt area in the Midwest, Nebraska, states like that. We tend to find a high concentration of pesticide residues in those states. Next slide, please. And so here you see again these trend lines, and you can see that in this case, insecticide concentration, what we're looking at is the bar charts in yellow, increases over time, whereas the amount of varroasides we're finding, the concentration of varroasides is decreasing over time. Next slide, please. And so when we look at the pesticide composition for all samples that have more than 1,000 parts per billion, that's the threshold where we think that it's just a high enough concentration that it may be problematic for bees to eliminate. And you can see in these bar charts that they're almost predominantly that light pink color. That light pink is from thymol. So the main contributor to these pesticide samples, there were 105 of the over 1,000 samples that had more than 1,000 parts per billion. And they were predominantly contaminated with thymol. That was the main contributor to that high pesticide concentration. Next slide, please. And so when we remove thymol, because thymol is something applied by beekeepers, and so it's not surprising that it's there in very high concentration. And what we find in our sentinel apiaries, where we go back and sample again and again, is you have these high spikes of thymol shortly after you've treated, but then they dissipate very quickly. And so when we look at only other pesticides other than thymol, we had 62 samples that were above 1,000. And you can see that each one of these bars tends to be made up of multiple colors. When each different color is a different type of pesticide residue that we're finding. And this is just to show that the composition in concentration is very diverse. There's lots of different products contributing to that composition. It's not that each bar is predominantly one color. Next slide, please. And so we did find a lot of fungicides detected at 1,000 plus. Colonies that experience queen issues tended to have elevated HQ scores. The scores tended to be about 3 times higher than in colonies that did not experience queen issues. So even though fungicides are considered to be safe, and so normally our threshold is 50 points in the HQ score, and with fungicides, we're way below 5. We do find that colonies that did not experience queen events have an HQ score of around 1 from the fungicides, whereas the colonies that experience queen events have an average HQ score from fungicides of 3.82, so more than 3 times as much. Next, please. And so hazard quotient, how do we actually calculate the true risk of consuming that pollen to honeybee health? And hazard quotients by the EPA are measured by the dose of the product divided by a screening benchmark. Next slide, please. And so in our case, that is the pollen pesticide residue divided by the LD50, this lethal dose 50, which kills off half of the bees in a cage experiment. Next, please. And so that's measured in parts per billion. And so you have to do some math because on average, a bee consumes about 100 milligrams in her nursing phase. And since this is measured in parts per billion, and so how many parts in a kilogram, you have to divide this score by 10,000. Next, please. Next, please. And so that screening benchmark is supposed to be a no adverse effects level. It's supposed to be a level where you're not seeing any impact on the health of the individual you're screening. Next, please. However, we're using an LD50, which is a 50% mortality rate. Next, please. And so instead of dividing by 10,000, we have to build in a food safety factor. So we use the EPA 10% food safety threshold. And so normally we would divide by 1,000. Next, please. However, we have a problem of scale with very, very small numbers. If I asked you to lend me a penny or a dime, you'd reach in your pocket, you wouldn't think twice, no problem at all. Next, please. However, if I ask you to lend me $100 versus $1,000, you might lend me the $100, but you'd probably want to guarantee that I would pay you back the $1,000. Next, please. The difference between the penny and the dime and the 100 and the 1,000 is of course identical. Next, please. And so when scale is small, it's really hard to conceptualize large differences. Risk is just easier to understand in larger values. And so because values below are hard for us, values below 1 are hard for us to visualize, we're not actually going to divide our HQ scores by 1,000. We're just going to show them to you. However, if you wanted to convert them into EPA numbers, you would have to divide by 1,000. Next, please. And so calculating risk. If the HQ is below 1,000, harmful effects are not likely. That HQ score is equal to 10% of an LD50. Again, in a simplified model where you're assuming a bee consumes this for 10 days during her nursing phase without detoxifying any of it. If the score is right around 1,000, then that contaminant alone is not likely to cause ecological risk. But when you add in other stress factors such as poor nutrition or varroa or viruses, then you might start to also see some impacts around 1,000. If the hazard quotient score is above 1,000, then harmful effects cannot be ruled out. Next, please. And so I apologize for walking you through a lot of math, but here's just an example from that National Honeybee Disease Survey. This sample had 3 different pesticides in it. It had a varroacide, it had chlorothalonil, and it had chlorpyrethos, so a fungicide and an insecticide. And when you take their parts per billion and you divide them by their respective LD50, you end up with a total HQ score of 150. So it's above our 50 threshold, so it would be considered above the noise, but it's substantially below the 1,000 threshold. And so we wouldn't consider this to be of great ecological risk. Next, please. However, here's another sample, again with 3 pesticide residues. And this time it was cyhalothrin, which is an insecticide, a fungicide, thiabendazole, and thiamethoxam, which is a neonicotinoid. And you can see that the 39.6 parts per billion of that neonicotinoid, because it has a very, 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 very low LD50, resulted in a really high score. So this pesticide residue would have a score above 2,000 and would be above our 1,000 score threshold. Next, please. And so when we look at significant pesticide diversity, this is how many samples do we find that have at least above that noisy threshold, right? That threshold of 1/20th of our LD50. There have a score of at least 50 points being contributed from a single pesticide. And you can see again that our agricultural states, California, Oregon, Florida, they tend to stick out here a little bit. The scale again is from 0 to 1. So if the state is tending more towards red, on average, we're finding at least 1 pesticide residue that's contributing at least 50 points. Next, please. And so beforehand, remember that very diverse pie chart where 40% of the products we were finding were varroacides. When we only look at these that are above our noisy threshold, the pesticides detections beforehand, we were at almost 3,000. We had 2,900 plus. Now we're down to 349. And the majority of them, 321 of them, over 90% are insecticides. The other 26 are varroacides, and then there was 1 fungicide and 1 herbicide. Whereas before I said that we had 60 neonicotinoid detections overall, here we still have 45 that are contributing at least 50 points. So whereas before the neonics made up only 2% of all detections, When we look at the significant pesticides, they make up 12% of the detections. So while we do not find neonicotinoids very often, we only found them 60 times out of 3,000 pesticide detections. When we do find them, they tend to be at a level where they could potentially be having an impact on consumption. They're above our noise threshold. They're still usually often below our 1,000 score threshold where we would expect to see impacts. Next slide, please. And so because we only really had insecticides, you can see that over time, the number of insecticides that are contributing at least 50 points is going down, and that it was not significant in anything else. Next, please. So our actual hazard quotient score here, this map is from 0 to 1,000. 1,000 is that risk threshold, and you can see that Oregon is a real outlier here. Oregon, we only had 10 samples over the entire sampling period, and some of those were contaminated quite heavily with really, really high pesticide residues, predominantly from a nuisance pesticide called prolethrin. But you can see that on average, we only had 5.6% of all samples that were above this 1,000 threshold, which, remember, 1,000 is the 10,000 is the lethal dose, and 1,000 is 10% of that. So it's still substantially below what we would expect to kill honeybees, but it might be a level where you start seeing some sublethal impacts. Next slide, please. And over time, there was no variance. You can see the trend lines are all pretty solid here. There were no significant differences over time. Next slide, please. So pesticide composition, remember before we looked at pesticide concentration, and those bars had lots and lots of different colors in them. And this time we have 57 of our 1,000 plus samples that are above the 1,000 threshold, but you can see that the majority of those bars are made up of a single color, except for the state of Nebraska where you see the dark blue and the light blue. Next, please. These are the main contributors. These are the insecticides that keep showing up again and again and again. And when they show up, they're problematic. And you can see that 3 neonicotinoids are part of that. They're clothianidin, imidacloprid, and thiamethoxam. In Nebraska, we saw 5 of the 6 samples had both clothianidin and thiamethoxam. Thiamethoxam is a breakdown product of clothianidin, so we don't know if the fields were treated with 2 different types of neonicotinoids or if we're catching the breakdown product of the one. But you can see that the traditional bad insecticides that we all know about, things like chlorpyrethros and carbaryl, are showing up in this chart, as well as prolethrin. Prolethrin is really considered a nuisance pesticide used to treat mosquitoes and fleas, often used by homeowners. Next slide, please. And so when we look at the breakdown by state, you can see that red line is at our 1,000-point threshold, and there are only 2 states that on average the samples are above that. That's Oregon and Delaware. Next, please. And in the states from Oregon, there were 3 samples that had really high levels of prolethrin, 3 samples with pyridovan, and 1 with chlorpyrethros. So 7 of those 26 samples were above 1,000. Whereas in Delaware, we had the 10 samples, and 2 of them were contaminated with really high levels of carbaryl, which brought the whole average up. And that's why you're also seeing that large standard error in those 2 bars, because there were some samples that had very, very high concentrations and then some samples that were quite low. Next slide, please. And so I find the amount of fungicides that we keep finding in samples somewhat alarming. When we first started sampling, we found a maximum of 4 different fungicides in a given sample. In the last year we surveyed in 2017, we had over 10 different fungicides in a single sample. You can see from this bar chart, the gray bars are the mean, the averages, whereas the black dots represent how many different fungicides we find in a single sample. And you can see that they're elevating over time. Almost every single year, it climbs by 1, and we're finding just a greater diversity of fungicides. Next slide, please. We also looked at the impact of varroicides with the number of varroa mites that were found on average in that apiary. And I apologize, it's a rather complicated graph, but let me walk you through it. From the bottom left to the far right, you'll see the 0, less than 3, less than 5, less than 10, and 10 plus mites. That's mites per 100 bees. And so you can see in the left-hand column, when we tend to have very low levels of mites, so no mites at all, we tend to have high levels of the breakdown product of amitraz, DMPF, and high levels of coumaphos. And so those two products seem to, at least during the time period this sample survey was conducted from 2011 to 2017, be very effective at eliminating varroa mites. When you find those residues in the pollen in that colony, you tend to find low levels of mites. But you can see we have the opposite trend with fluvalinate and thymol. We tend to have lots of fluvalinate residue and lots of thymol residue when we have very high varroa mite levels. We don't know if this is because the treatments weren't working and that's why we had very high varroa mite levels, or if beekeepers realized they had very high varroa mite levels and then threw in fluvalinate or thymol to try and bring that down. So this is just a correlation, it's not causation, but it's a very interesting new trend that low mite levels were associated with amitraz and coumaphos and high mite levels were associated with thymol and fluvalinate. Again, this may also be changing in the United States. These samples we stopped collecting in 2017, bee bread samples, and there's a growing concern that we now have resistance in varroa mites to amitraz. Next, please. This is just a look of nosema. Nosema is a fungal spore that sporulates in the gut and leads to dysentery. And again, it's a rather complicated graph, but on the bottom left, you see colonies, that first column is with 0 nosema spores. The middle columns are less than 1 million spores, and the far right columns are above 1 million spores. The bars in gray represent total for all pesticides, whereas the bars in orange represent fungicides. And if you look at that very bottom, so on the left-hand side, you see HQ on the bottom row, 50 plus, then concentration, diversity, and prevalence. And again, each one of those is our different measure of risk. What we found is that we had nosema in 43% of our apiaries, and on average, we had 0.3 million spores per bee. Apiaries with undetectable nosema had a lower pesticide diversity compared to apiaries with nosema. And samples with nosema tended to have fungicide HQ scores that were 3 times higher than nosema-free samples. And so you would think that as a fungal spore, fungicides might actually protect bees, but we're finding the exact opposite. So potentially this could be an indicator that when you have a lot of fungicides in a colony, the beneficial fungi that would normally keep nosema in check get eliminated, and then these bad actors can proliferate. Next slide, please. So pesticides that contributed at least 50 plus and more than 10 samples. So these are what we consider our relevant pesticide residues. And I just wanted to list them out so that you see that they're almost all insecticides as well as one varroicide, fluvalinate is in there. And that you can see that some of them we detect quite often. So bifenthrin was detected 44 times, chlorpyrifos 128 times. Next, please. And you can see that carbaryl, clothianidin, and prolephrine are really of concern because when we do detect them, they're often contributing significantly above our max 1,000 threshold. You can see that the mean score there for prolephrine, for example, is over 7,000. And this is because we had one sample where the score was 30,000, so above our LD50 actually. It's just a really high concentration of prolephrine. Next, please. We also sampled some of these apiaries for brood disease. They were simultaneously inspected for overt symptoms. Unfortunately, not all colonies, so of the 1,000 plus apiaries that were sampled, 150 were also investigated for American foul brood, European foul brood, sac brood, chalk brood, and snot brood. Brood disease was detected in almost 30% of those inspected apiaries. And what we found was that the fungicide HQ was elevated in samples from apiaries that were positive for brood disease. So in colonies that had no brood disease, their HQ fungicide score was about 1.2, whereas in colonies where we had brood disease, it was just over 4. Again, this is just correlation, not causation, but when we have high levels of fungicide, we seem to have more levels of brood disease. Next slide, please. And so I know that was a lot of information. You probably feel like I've downloaded a bunch on you, but I just wanted to go over a summary of the findings. So the good news is that not all pollen is contaminated. The United States has a lot more active ingredients for pesticides on the market than the EU. And yet, even within the United States, 18% of all samples we collected, and remember, this is not from an individual hive, but from a whole apiary, were pesticide free. Only 5.4% were above our HQ threshold of 1,000, which is equivalent to 10% of an LD50. So it's still only 5.4% are above that food threshold safety. And this is, again, a simplified model, assuming no detoxification over 10 days of a nursing phase. Next, please. We also find that pesticide diversity is potentially increasing over time. So although samples were contaminated with many pesticides, we found up to 21 different pesticide residues in a single pollen sample. The average was only 2.7. However, most contain very few relevant pesticides. So when we just look at the ones that exceed our 50-point threshold, eliminate the noise, we go from over 2,900 detections to 349. And then the max number we find that of different pesticide residues with at least 50 plus was 5, and the average is 0.3. Next, please. Pesticide class is a very important indicator. The majority of the hazard quotient was contributed by insecticides. This is not surprising. Insecticides are designed to kill insects. Honeybees are insects. So of course, those are the things, the pesticide class that has the highest level of toxicity. Neonicotinoids were not frequently detected, but when they were detected, they tend to dramatically increase the hazard quotient score. Next, please. And fungicide residues over time are increasing. The quantity detected increased from a max of 4 to 10. And although they are not a large contributor to the hazard quotient, they are often detected at high parts per billion, so high concentration, and they were tied to an increase in brood disease and nosema. Next, please. And so here you see the major take-homes that there's a clear relationship between in-field exposures and what we could term honeybee stress. The idea that fungicides are bee safe and no threat to bee health needs reconsidering. Overall, most beekeepers are not exposed to risky exposure, and there are a concerning level of pesticides, but they're caused by a handful of insecticides. There's about 11 different insecticides that we find problematic that show up frequently. Next, please. So I'm now happy to take any questions if time permits.
Towards the second half of that, you mentioned snot brood. I'm not sure that the UK National Bee Unit has that on its list of things that we should be aware of.
Sorry, which one?
Snot brood.
Oh, right.
Could you give us a quick overview? And just as a quick
so
follow-up.
Snot brood is something that beekeepers in the US, it's not EFB. It looks like EFB, but when they send it in for diagnosis, it's not EFB. We're not actually sure what causes snot brood, but it's a runny, disintegrated larva during development, and beekeepers are calling it snot brood. If you send me an email, I can give you the paper on snot brood.
Hi, I just wondered if US farmers and US beekeepers are aware of these things and if they're actually doing anything about it now, if behaviours are changing, seeing as how your data was collected up to 217 and we're now at 2021.
Excellent question. So it's very, very difficult in the United States for farmers to move away from pesticides. And this is in part due to the way insurance works for crop insurance. You're required to use best management practices. Otherwise, if your crop fails, you don't get a payout. And a lot of those best management practices have a specific routine that require treatments at given times. There's definitely growing awareness for this, and beekeepers are trying to find land that they can have access to that is away from agriculture. The problem is there's a growing debate about keeping honeybees off of public lands. And so where beekeepers normally go to get away from saturation into their honey producing yards, a lot of that land is now being turned into cropland as well. So North Dakota and South Dakota used to have a lot of conservation reserve programs where there were a lot of meadows that were very rich in wildflowers. And unfortunately, with the ethanol prices having gone up, a lot of that land was turned into corn. So there's just fewer and fewer spots for beekeepers to go to. It's a growing issue.
Kirsten, in the UK, we've got sort of national registration. What's the situation in the United States? Is it a national registration or is it state registration?
It's state by state and it varies by state. So Maryland, where I used to live, it's required to register your apiaries, but in many states it's not. So it's very, very difficult to even know where beekeepers are.
I mean registration of the products, the chemicals.
Oh, I believe farmers are required to state what they are, and we have very good GIS maps that show croplands. That is one of the reasons we can do a lot more analysis on landscapes surrounding apiaries. There's a wonderful program out of Pennsylvania called Beescape, I believe it is, where you can actually pinpoint an apiary and see what the forage in the area around it is.
Hi, specifically talking about fungicides, do you know of any action that is being taken by the manufacturers to review the risk information?
I do not know of any. We're working on a white paper with a group of scientists to try and address some of these issues that are not currently addressed with current pesticide regulations. But fungicides, because they do not kill off adult bees, are considered bee safe.
Thank you for a very interesting lecture, well presented. My question is, LD50 actually measures toxicity. Have you looked at genetic effect of these chemicals?
No, I've just worked with the sampling data in LD50s. So I have not done the genetic work. I know there's a lot of other labs trying to see if there are some toxicity resistance and impacts on stress regulation.
In the UK, we're supposed to have a notification system whereby farmers inform local beekeepers when and which pesticides they're using or which products they're using so that beekeepers can shut their bees in. Is there any sort of system like that in the US? Not that it works particularly well in the UK.
I believe there are some state-by-state initiatives so that beekeepers are more informed. For the most part, farmers are not out there trying to kill bees. It's problematic for them as well, and they would much rather keep their pollinators alive. Unfortunately, the reporting systems and the interactions are not always as ideal as we want.
I spotted on the screen you had paradichlorobenzene. Now, that was used in the UK for control of wax moth, and that's been banned here for some time. What's the situation in the US? Are you still allowed to use it for wax moth, and how would it get into the colonies if not?
I don't know if it's still legally allowed to be used. I'd have to double check. I know it used to be used, and you can still buy it for mothball control in the United States, and not everybody uses things by the label as they should.